Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We've got a slightly small group today. So we're going to power on. Don't worry too much about the materials. Obviously, feel free to contact Nash if you do have trouble downloading them, but I am going to be sharing everything that you need on the screen today. So you'll be able to follow through. If you've just got the screen in front of you, you'll be able to see all of the scripts. It's really lovely to have you all with us today. And I feel a little bit bizarre speaking into the ether because I can't see anybody, but I'm hoping you're all there. Just to check you're all alive, alert, and ready to go, I would really like just to share one word in the chat that sums up how your students feel about the coursework task. Is it a positive? Is it a negative experience? I would love it if you could just type one word into the chat just to give me a sense. Intimidated, I can empathize with that. Just to give me a sense of what I'm working with in terms of the students. Nervous, excited, overwhelmed, intimidated. I'm really enjoying some of these suggestions in terms of creativity and passion, because the reason that I ask is often what separates language and literature from the other two solo courses is the free choice that they have with the coursework task and the creative option, as well as the analytical option at the same time. So I'm guessing those who feel excited and passionate about it, that was probably one of the main reasons for choosing this particular course over the others. So I just wanted to open the discussion really just with a reminder that the coursework really does offer the students the opportunity to do what they love most with English, and that's explore their personal choice and dive a little bit deeper into the texts and genres that they feel really, really passionate about. So if they're intimidated, if they're overwhelmed, please reassure them that this is a space that's here for their interest, and it's an opportunity for them to really get their teeth into something that has a lot of personal choice. And those who find that their students are passionate and creative, then absolutely tap into that and let them fly with it. You'll see lots of different options in the pack that we've got for you today. We've got lots of different types of students, and particularly with the stronger folders, you can really hear their personality and their voice coming through in the texts that they've created. So any opportunity to do that is never a wasted opportunity with those students. So it's really nice to hear that we've got some people excited and enthused, but I totally sympathize with any of the intimidated students behind the scenes as well. Hopefully after today, you'll be able to reassure any concerns that they've got, because this is actually a really, really lovely task. And it's just an opportunity to take the pressure of the exam away and let them actually explore something that has real interest to them. So welcome to the session. I'm going to be taking you through all of the English language and literature elements of marking coursework assessment. Please don't be worried that we're going to put you on the spot and ask for marks today. That's not the aim of this session by any means. The aim is to explore the assessment criteria and just get you feeling a bit more secure and a bit more confident when ascribing levels and marks for particular examples of commonalities in student work. So the folders that we found for you today have some interesting examples of things that we encounter each year, difficulties when it comes to leveling or best fit approaches, as well as some examples of really good practice and some examples of errors that are quite easy to correct with a little bit of time, care, and editing. So hopefully your concerns will be allayed by the end of today's session, but if not, then you have our contact details and you can reach out and get in touch, and all of the available materials will be there for download so you can have a little bit more of a look through. I'm going to get through as many folders as I can today. Obviously, in a 2-hour session, some of these will be takeaway folders, but we wanted to give you as many materials as possible. And I've got a strategy that hopefully will serve us well for the next 2 hours. You'll be doing some example marking, maybe sharing some ideas or any questions more likely that you have about particular marks. You'll be looking at some example folders, as well as a difference really of the different approaches to this task, as well as addressing some common issues. I'm sure you all maybe have some questions. We do deliver this coursework training yearly. However, I'm sure that there are some specific questions that you may well have. If I don't cover those in the first 15 minutes of this session, going through some of those kind of popular or common Q&A issues, then do feel free to put those in the chat. And if they're not answered by the end of that session, we will make sure that we get the answers to you. Equally, if it's something that you've got a specific concern about with coursework texts, for example, we'll be sharing you the link for the coursework advisory service where you can get a little bit more advice if you feel like it's something quite specific that you're looking for. So hopefully we will cover everything today, but if not, do please shout and we will get to you. A loose overview, I will say. I'm going to keep as best as I can to this schedule, but I'm reluctant to hold me accountable too much for these timings. But we're going to be going through, starting with an overview of some common questions that might answer some that you already have. I'm going to do a recap of the mark schemes. It's useful to have those nearby if you have them already, and hopefully you can download those from the website as well if you do need a refresher of any of the marks. Some of you may well be able to recite them and sleep during your sleep, are able to visualize them. So please feel free to use those depending on your level of comfort with the exam mark schemes. The marking itself should take the majority of the session. And at the end, we'll give you some guidance towards the submission of folders and any of the administrative procedure towards the end. There will be some time for questions, but I highly doubt there'll be 15 minutes. So do feel free to share those questions as and when they crop up for you. To start the session, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the principal moderator's reflection on this series. And you can read the whole of the moderator overview. You can download that from the Pearson website, and it's worth doing, particularly if you're perhaps in your first early years of teaching these courses and you haven't had much experience with this coursework before. Maybe this is the first time you've taught with Edexcel. Maybe this is the first time you've taught this particular specification in terms of language and literature, but you've had experience on language or literature in their solo courses. So please do reach out to those moderator reports. They're a really, really useful resource, and they give a really high level overview of some things to look out for. Often they're quite useful to share with students in terms of pointers. But specifically for this year, I think two words that I want to focus on most, really: energy and enthusiasm. What's coming across from a lot of the folders this year is the sense of something that you've shared as well in your chat, that excitement that students have to show their voice and to share their ideas in a very kind of in a very formulated way. So they can pick a format that really suits them, and they've got a mouthpiece, they've got a soapbox to share those ideas. We are going to be seeing some of those students today in the folders, but I would very much encourage you to really ask your students what their interests, what their passions are, and find ways in which this coursework task can really speak to some of those passions, because it's an amazing opportunity for them to dig deeper into what they love. Candidates who used personal experience and family interviews produced some extraordinary work. And I'm not saying that they all need to have a backstory or a sob story to be able to draw on, but there was some really interesting use of own experience or shared experience of friends, for example, that's prompted a wider discussion or a wider bit of research into something that they have found interesting. We see a lot of politically engaged candidates, students who are obviously part of debate clubs, model UNs, etc. Students who really have some concerns about what's happening in the world around them. And I'd encourage them to reach out to the news, reach out, even if they're absorbing news on social media, just that whole process of living in the world around them, tap into the concerns that they have, the passions that they have, because this is such a good opportunity for discussion. And we'll see some interesting core and stimulus texts that candidates have been using as well. I'm going to talk about that process if anybody has questions about how to use stimulus texts in class. So if you do have those questions, feel free to share them, but those answers should be coming quite soon for you. So just to take away some of these ideas of how engaging work was when it came from that personal investment. If you can encourage students to do so, please, please do. It really does benefit them. And you'll see that from the work that we're going to look at today as well. If it's your first time teaching this specification, then it's worth just noting or reminding you just of the format itself. So the whole folder is going to consist of around 3,000 words. Again, perhaps questions about word count here and penalisation for going over a word count. As is ever our answer, it is to a degree self-penalising if you go over the word count, because usually it means that they haven't been able to concisely do the job that they need to do. And in some effect, that will self-penalise them. Can I add a link to the mark schemes as I'm new to the spec? Magdalene, sorry. I'll try to find that one for you. I believe it's in the materials, and might be behind in the background here. She might be able to share it quicker than I can. But I'll try to find that for you. If you haven't, don't worry. I'm going to do an overview of the mark schemes in a second, so you'll be able to see them. And don't worry if you're new to it, just take some time and just read through the scripts, get a feel for, Angie's got it, she's on it, great. But just get a feel for the students' work. Don't worry too much about the marks that can come later. Thank you for that, Angie. So we've got a folder that should consist of 3,000 words. Try to encourage them to keep as much as possible to 3,000, more for your own peace of mind than anything else, because you're going to be working with them to produce that portfolio. AO5 is only examined in the first two pieces. So they create a piece of original writing and a piece of non-fiction and fiction original writing. So AO5 is the creative construction, essentially, that they're going to be going through. And in terms of assignment 2, that's their critical commentary. So you've got a kind of exploration of how they crafted those pieces of work, the stimulus that they used in order to get there. So that doesn't require an assessment of AO5. So it's only assignment 1 where we'll be assessing AO5. The other AOs are assessed in assignment 2. And that gives us the spread across the whole of the course to ensure that we've met the requirements from JCQ for all of the assessment objectives. I want to just really remind everybody that there is a free choice of texts for students. There is no obligation that they need to stick to a prescribed list of set text for their core materials, and it's highly encouraged that they read more widely different examples of the genres that they choose to write in. So it may well be that they take something specific from their stimulus text, but in terms of the actual construction of, for example, a podcast, they may well need to go and look at some genre conventions of podcast outside of their stimulus text. They should log all of that in their bibliography, which again we'll discuss throughout the session. So by the end you'll see some good examples, some, I would say, unnecessarily detailed examples of bibliographies, and equally you'll see students who perhaps aren't noting as much as we would like them to as well. The fiction texts can be chosen from absolutely any genre, but just make sure that the non-fiction requirement is as rigorous and robust as you would expect from fiction. So they can look at a collection of articles, for example, but they do need to look at quite a wide, possibly a published edited version of a selection of articles would be a better bet for that one in terms of their non-fiction. So hopefully that gives you a nice overview of what the portfolio should look like in terms of the breakdown of assessment objectives, the word count, and the requirement of core and stimulus materials. But again, as we go through this session, I'll give you some examples of how that can be constructed and how that can be presented by students. One of the key things that we get each year is about non-fiction text. And I would always encourage you to reach out to the Coursework Advisory Service if you're ever unsure. Usually, if you have to ask the question, it's because there's a sense of doubt, and that sense of doubt is perhaps triggering you to know maybe there is an issue with this task, with this requirement. But non-fiction, in terms of AO5, we're looking for them to use expertise and creativity. So if we want them to move through those levels, they need to choose genres and they need to choose examples of text that allow them the opportunity to be creative and to show those expertise. So in order to meet that requirement, it's really important that they have got good source material texts and that they understand the genre requirements of the texts that they want to be able to produce. So what constitutes non-fiction? You can see some examples here for bullet point 4, for example, an eyewitness account of a historic event such as the coronation or a newspaper article from the 60s might use non-fiction devices, but it's still fiction. It's a fictional creation. It's a fictional narrative perspective, even though the event took place. It might be a historical event. They were not at that event. Therefore, they are creating the perspective of someone who was there. Therefore, it falls into the realm of fiction, not non-fiction. So just if you're ever unsure of that, please reach out to the Coursework Advisory Service. But generally, if you're unsure, that's often telling you something that maybe they need to be a bit more secure about their genre choices. If they're writing about past events, students are advised to take a contemporary reflection. So it may well be that they want to draw a comparison between something that's happening right now and an event in the past, rather than focusing on the event in the past. Equally, if they wanted to submit that particular thing as a fiction text, nothing would be stopping them from doing that. It's just always a grey area when they're asking about non-fiction. Just because they're writing an article, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's non-fiction just because it's an article. if they've had to make things up, if they've had to create a narrative perspective, ultimately, that generally tends to signal fiction. If you do have any questions about that, as I said, do reach out during the session or use the Coursework Advisory Service if you're unsure. One of the requirements that we ask of all students, and hopefully you've all seen this, if you're brand new to the specification, this is something that can be downloaded in the coursework materials section of the website. Those of you who are more seasoned experts at this, you know, obviously each year you need to download the most recent version, and encourage as much as possible students to fill that out as accurately. You can actually share it as in an electronic copy with students for them to perhaps put the title in themselves, and they can complete their centre name, centre number, etc. Obviously, the signatures, as much as possible, need to be printed. However, it may well be that teachers use this as an opportunity to maybe put summary comments on that front page rather than on the text itself. That's completely personal choice and entirely up to you. It's quite useful sometimes for the moderators to be able to read high-level overview comments from the teachers, particularly if you've got maybe a tricky folder or you've got a particularly impassioned student or a topic area that might be quite controversial. That might be a really good opportunity to maybe just flag that with the moderators. Or if you've got a particular reason that you gave it a particular mark and you want to foreground that on that front page, then please take the comment section as an opportunity to do so. You can do that electronically and the boxes will expand so that you can fit in all of those comments. You don't need to handwrite it in that tiny, tiny little box. If it serves you better to do it electronically and expand on it, then by all means do so, but just make sure that everything is signed and dated with a really clear list of all of your marking allocations so the moderators can hopefully agree with no concerns whatsoever. We will see an example today of some bad practice where the students didn't complete the text coverage check. The reason that we ask this, we're not just being pedants for the sake of it, although it may seem like it, and I appreciate that concern. But the reason that we ask is that, again, by JCQ requirements, we have to cover a certain amount of texts, and those texts need to be different. So we need to ensure that the students haven't covered their exam texts in the coursework. It has to be two separate texts so that it fulfills the requirement and rigor of an A-level course. So that's the reason behind this. So please just encourage your students, or even just check the box for them at the back to make sure we know which text you covered for the exam, and then we can check there's no disparity with the text that they've chosen for their core and stimulus text. They may well pick another text from the same writer. That's not a problem. It just needs to be a different text selection so that we can ensure that they've met the requirements that are set down by JCQ. So that's not us being pedants. That's just us making sure we're following the rules. And it means they've earned their A-level if they've read 6 texts as well. In terms of the options, we've been offering this specification, this coursework piece for quite some time now. So there are quite a lot of options, and certainly each year there's a kind of set amount of set texts almost, because they seem to be popular choices by centres. Equally, there's absolutely no reason that you have to take any of these examples that we share with you. If you want some inspiration, there are more resources available to you on the website in the coursework guide area. If you want some examples of pairings of texts or text example choices for fiction and non-fiction tasks, then do please look at that section, because there's some good starting points, but as far and wide as possible, give students free rein to pick the text that really speaks to them and offers them. I'm just going to draw your attention to the chat because the delegate materials have now been shared, so you're able to access those if anyone's had any issues already. Thank you for that. But yeah, back to the text selections. Encourage free choice with students. If they have a passion, lean into that, do some research with that. It doesn't need to be done in their first year. This can be an ongoing. They have 2 years to complete this course. They may well start reading a text, realize it's not for them, do some further reading. They might do some wider reading as part of their Voices anthology study, and that might spark an interesting discussion for them. So encourage them to follow their passions and choose core and stimulus texts that really speak to those passions and interests. It really does provide so much more valuable and quality work. There's an example pairing here of The Crucible with Lolita in Tehran, and this was a fiction task of a short story based on the Salem witch trials, and the non-fiction text would be a broadsheet investigative article about drug trafficking. So you can see there's some stimulus links to thematic ideas in both of those texts without it being an exact replica of those texts. And I think it's always tricky to get that balance of how do we teach students to use stimulus texts as exactly that, as a stimulus, not as something they then need to go away and emulate. And we'll see some different approaches to that in the coursework folders that we're going to look at today. There are nice hyperlinks here for you. So in those event materials, you will find hyperlinks from this presentation today to some of the guidance on that coursework, some generic overviews of problems that we've encountered from the start of this specification, some things that arise each year with some guidance of how to do that. We've got some examples from last year's event, from our coursework event last year, so that you can see more examples of marking. They do follow the same format. We go down in quality, we go down in mark scheme, so it's easy to follow that route. And also the link to the coursework advisory service that I mentioned before. So if you do have any specific issues with any pairings that your current students are thinking about, just hit it straight to the coursework advisory service. They will give you a clear yes, no, or some advice on how to move forward with your suggestion. Into the marking grids. This is where we're going to get specific and we're going to start looking at some folders. So both the original writing pieces, the fiction and the non-fiction, are distributed over 18 marks, and we're purely looking at AO5. So you don't need to worry about the other descriptors at this point here or the other assessment objectives. Your descriptors match only with AO5 because this is about their ability to create a text and their ability to craft with a certain level of skill. So at the bottom level, we're going to see low, quite generic, imprecise skills. At level 1 and level 2 is often very easy to recognize. Usually within level 1, you're going to see very little material. Hopefully very few students will actually be in this level, and it's a very small number each year. And usually there's reasons behind that. So very rarely do we see anybody in level 1. Level 2 would generally indicate a very imprecise ability. So for example, if it's a short story, sometimes it's difficult to perhaps show a good range of coverage of skills within that genre. So students who pick very wide options for their genre choices often make a difficult task for themselves in terms of being able to show all of those generic conventions and their ability to craft, being mindful of those conventions. So we will see errors, you will see lapses, but more importantly, at that very low level, you're going to see a very, very weak awareness of audience and purpose. And that's generally easy to identify in the initial discussions where they're talking to you about their ideas. Often if a student is really, they've got a very vague idea of what it is that they want to do, some honing, some editing can help them move out from that level if they're a slightly weaker writer and they do struggle with this kind of task. At the other end of this, we're looking at perhaps the rest of the assessment objectives in the commentary task. So a lot of students you'll see will be falling into the level 4 category of the commentary. We have a level above this, and obviously we've moved past the 18 marks here for this point. So you've got a much wider range of marks to play with the commentary task, but equally that can sometimes come with its vices as well. So moving from 18 to 24 marks in that commentary task can often open a bit of a headache in terms of switching from your descriptors and your leveling categories. But we've put here a summary of what would usually indicate the large majority of students who generally produce work in this level 4 category. And what characterizes level 4 is the ability to be discriminative and controlled. And by that, I mean they have a clear sense of audience, purpose, and genre, and they can complete a piece of work that fulfills that requirement and sustain that voice all the way through, with hopefully some engagement as well. So consider yourselves as kind of an editor almost. You're the first read, you're the first eyes on this text. If you lose your engagement, then that's an opportunity for the student to perhaps go away and have a look at what they can do to get that engagement back on their text. If they're moving upwards into level 4, it's just an engaging piece to read. We're going to see today some of the folders of students whose work is genuinely engaging. It's interesting to read and you can hear their voice behind it as well. It's clear to see those folders. What becomes difficult is when it's more difficult for them to sustain that voice throughout the text. And that's when it's an indicator that perhaps they haven't done enough to reach level 4. Across the whole of the body of their work as well, you may well find that they're a slightly better non-fiction writer than a fiction writer. They might be better at analysing their work than creating their work. Every student is different, and no approach is wrong necessarily. If anything, the mark scheme is really written to provide an opportunity for you to give a best fit approach. So that overall mark out of 60 gives you the opportunity to give an overall picture of that student. They may not have done so well in one task, but really well in another task, and that might compensate for them. So this is a really good chance for them really to show their strengths, but equally to be aware of their weaknesses as well, and make sure that there's a way of bringing those up and perhaps compensating if they're slightly better analytical writers than creative writers, or the other way around. Okay, I'm going to look at some example work here. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and I'm going to take you to the first folder. So hopefully you're able to see these folders in your delegate materials. I'm going to share the first folder with you. Here we go. And this is, you can see the whole PDF here. Sorry if that's a bit untidy, but it's the best way to do it. You can see here, the reason I'm showing this as the PDF is because you can see the teachers' comments as well. So as well as the students' work, you can see a running commentary from teachers. And this is a good opportunity for you to look at best practice in terms of your contributions to their coursework. Also, you'll notice that this piece of work starts with the commentary. There's no set order necessarily that they have to follow. They can start with their commentary, they can start with their fiction pieces or non-fiction pieces. My advice would also always be, remember that this is going to a moderator who doesn't know your student and they don't know how they work, or they don't know any of the context behind their choices. So if perhaps their fiction or non-fiction texts needs a bit more context or a bit more explanation, you might choose to put the commentary first because it provides that context that they need to understand a bit more about the fiction and the non-fiction piece. That's entirely up to you. You'll be happy to know that I'm only going to read this folder in full to give you a sense of the student's work. The others, I'm going to give you some reading time on your own, and I'm just going to read one of the pieces. But all the way through, I will be sharing the marks for each of those. I can happily tell you that it will be no shock that this student moves into level 5 for this folder. It's not quite full marks, but it's a very, very close attempt. And it might be that you want to ask some questions during the process as to why it wasn't full marks, and hopefully I'll be able to give you those answers. But what I hope you take from this text is the sense of engagement and personal voice. Even just that opening line of the commentary, you can see here, not every teenager is elated with a greenhouse for her 15th birthday, but I was. So obviously, we've got a student here who's got a very clear passion. We can see just, again, the rise in interest in environmental issues of this particular generation of students. So it's nice to see that coming through in the coursework as well. But let's have a look at some elements of this piece that make it level 5 worthy. My love of plants has since grown and since working at botanical gardens, which inspired my writing to show the benefits and beauty of plants, yet the destructive, myopic ways of humans. Environmental issues fit into the topic of society and the individual, as it needs to be a global and personal responsibility. So we've got a nice sense, first of all, one of, I think we get the sense of the student's personality. I can imagine they're a very vocal member of this class. I imagine they contribute regularly to discussions. I bet they're an interesting perspective to have on different issues, but they've identified the individual and society as the clear theme to link their core and stimulus text. So that's a really good sense of purpose in this task right from the start. I was inspired by two main stimulus texts, The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini and Cupcakes and Kalashnikovs, edited by Eleanor Mills. My TED Talk, Our Mightiest Ally Has Switched Sides, raises awareness of deforestation to sixth former students and will be delivered at the annual TED Talk School Competition. Desperate, my dystopian piece to be published in an anthology of short stories is about an old lady watching her garden die in a drought due to climate change. It similarly aims to raise awareness of environmental issues and promote action. Absolutely great start. Excellent introduction, clear sense of purpose, clear sense of genre, and also sense of the why. Why have they crafted this piece? Why do these pieces belong anywhere? What's the message behind them? So we get a real sense of purpose right from the start. It's very, very clear and concise also. In Desperate, the extended metaphor personifies the plants as patients through medical lexis, remedies, ward, casualties. Here, the apocalyptic tone signposts to the dystopian piece as images of suffering, enables us to feel more emotionally attached to the plants, hyperbolizing the state of the garden. Similarly, in ally, an extended metaphor presented through the lexical field of battle, warrior, ally, forfeiting, foregrounds the severity of deforestation in amplifying climate change. Moreover, with the extended metaphor of battle, a tone of camaraderie is later exemplified. Let's add to the list deforestation ended 2024. This final declarative motivates the audience to unify as a specific goal is given. The colon implies a pause, allowing the audience to reflect on their capability and achievements as a nation. And the contraction let's concludes the talk in a low register to inspire collective, immediate action. So there, a nice range of devices and a clear sense of purpose through crafting. I can understand from reading this piece that this student had a clear aim and knows exactly where that aim is being met by being able to pinpoint specifically from their texts how their crafting has helped them achieve that. And that's really the purpose of the commentary. Later throughout this text, we'll start to see some links with their core and stimulus material, but I would really encourage them just to get down to the nitty-gritty in these opening statements and get them to explore the why behind their creation, because it really does help give that sense of purpose and helps the moderator understand why they made those particular choices. Furthermore, the extended metaphors complemented in both, conveying the preciousness of nature. The repetition of our mightiest ally has switched sides brings cohesion, instilling a tone of urgency, and the superlative mightiest suggests a saving, omnipotent force, conveying the importance of rainforest, re-emphasizing through the noun ally. Contrastingly, in Desperate, the superlative in the reported speech, sweet as if she was the most wonderful sunset for the nose, portrays nature's vulnerability. Here, the simile links to the motif of the sun, inspired by the cohesive motif of kites in The Kite Runner, creating a sense of awe as the synesthesia demonstrates the sensual delight of the flower. Moreover, the past tense encapsulates a voice of grief like a respectful obituary. I think we can all be very proud of a student who can manage to concisely convey their intention quite as well as this student did. Likely this wasn't their first attempt. I'm sure they've edited it, but that's the beauty of coursework. They have these opportunities to edit, to craft, and to really make the most of the opportunity that the coursework offers. You can see there a link to that the inspired core materials in brackets. I would encourage them always, they don't need to put that in brackets. They can absolutely make that part of the sentence. Part of the task is understanding how that stimulus material contributed to their crafting. So they don't need to put that in brackets. That can absolutely be part of the text itself. The aim of both texts is for readers to feel emotionally invested in environmental issues. In Desperate, pathos is invoked when plants are associated with a hospice, whereas in Ally, it's the colloquial language that allows students to connect. The satirical tone in the opening phrase, our belching out of climate change spiel, is distracting us from actually acting, utilizes the onomatopoeic verb to create humor and convey an audacious voice through the abrupt sound belching, subtly indicating the media's coverage of climate change whilst being able to engage teenagers or a teenage audience. The repetition of similar phrases at the end also creates a cyclical structure, bringing cohesion. The ambiguous noun spiel is vague language portraying an image of nonsense, comically ridiculing the volume of news given about climate change. The slang flex and skiving presents the talk colloquially, capturing teenagers' attention, whilst the esoteric reference to the parenthesis, sorry, no excuses for skiving school here, links to the student strikes, highlighting a cutting undertone and a mocking voice. Not quite sure about esoteric references. I think they're referring to skiving there, which I believe would just be slang. However, in this instance, you can see the student really thinking about the reasons behind some of their crafting choices, and equally a conscious sense of why certain techniques need to be foregrounded in this commentary. So it was a good choice for them to start with the commentary because it explains that rationale before they go into those texts, and we can start to put context behind some of those choices when we come to read their original material. Both texts have a consistent voice of exigency. In desperate, the one-word declarative, desperate, connotes utter helplessness, whilst the repetition creates cohesion and a countdown effect mirrored in ally. Another 3 hectares have been cut down. This magnifies a voice of anger and an urgent call to action, like The Right to Life by Alice Walker from Cupcakes, where the repeated rhetorical question punctuates the speech, giving it rhythm. That's a really good example of how a student can make reference to their core material. So it doesn't need to be necessarily an exact replication of what a writer's done. It can just acknowledge how it influenced their crafting. That's a really, really good example of how it can be done concisely and effectively. The determinative another enforces the reality of the enormity of deforestation and exaggerates the tone of exasperation. Also, the statistic here is coupled, just like some are in Julie Flint's Mountains of Hell from Cupcakes. 1/3 of our carbon emissions dropped 66% as this TED Talk convention builds a voice of authority and credibility that galvanizes people to educate themselves on the rainforest. So in terms of the AOs, the coverage here from AO1 to AO4 is really, really interesting. The students managed to concisely really hit on why they've done the things that they've done with a really good range of features in relation to their own crafting. They're obviously incredibly diligent and a very conscious student in terms of being able to analyze the rationale, which is a really good student, I guess. If they were in my class, I would be thrilled to have a student who is that honed in and that specific in terms of being able to pinpoint the devices that they're actually using. In Ally, the field-specific lexis of rainforests like cocoa and animals creates integrity, like India Knight's medical lexis in Thank God I Let My Baby Live from Cupcakes, aiming to educate students about the imminent problem of deforestation and motivating them in the salvation found in the rainforest. Similarly, in Desperate, the interjections of horticultural field-specific lexis, drooping, dewdrops, turgidity, implies a knowledgeable tone, demonstrating the lady's experience, but also seeks to warn readers by contrasting images of horticultural beauty with images of ugliness. Inspired by the juxtaposition between winning and losing in The Kite Runner, this connotes the antagonistic force of climate change, building tension as the garden is destroyed. Again, another really, really well-developed link to their core stimulus material. It's obvious that they've understood The Kite Runner beyond simply the narrative. They've understood the crafting, and that's what's been their inspiration. They haven't simply taken the material within the Kite Runner and simply replicated that in a similar scenario, in a similar country, in a similar background. They've taken that narrative approach that they found effective and recreated that with a theme that speaks to them. Really good example of how to use core materials. The triplet Precious Time, Fuchsia and Gold, and Wonderful Fiesta of Rich Magenta utilizes color and euphony to be able to enable sensory imagery. Moreover, the pre-modifiers Precious, Rich imply luxury and invaluable beauty, reminding readers of the visual joy gardens can bring. This is contrasted by the image of blandness, baked, beige, hideous / barren, with the voice of disgust enhanced by the bilabials. Sorry, I actually lost my place there. I'll go in this way. Enhanced by bilabials. The onomatopoeia of the adjective phrase hideous / creates disturbance, implying pain and violence, as readers are cautioned about the reality of climate change. This is intensified when the fricatives and fragmentation foreground the tension used in the climate change when describing the aphid attacks. I don't know if it was their intention to include fricatives when analysing fricatives, that might be too meta. However, very, very good crafting in terms of this student's analytical voice. Excellent AO1 and 2 at that point. Ally also uses fricatives, futile, frivolous, fulfillment, to portray a similar voice of disgust, but at mankind's attitude. Desperate follows dystopian genre conventions as inspired by Ray Bradbury's short stories. A futuristic tone is established by the subheading East Sussex, Nimble Cottage, June 2026, inspired by the temporal marker used in the exposition of Bradbury's The Pedestrian. Not only does the location give verisimilitude, but the phonology of Nimble Cottage is soft, creating an initial setting of serenity, intriguing the reader. If you have students who aren't quite so advanced in perhaps some of their choices in terms of technical terminology, please don't worry. I think this student could have explained that with equally, maybe more simplistic terms. But if students are willing, absolutely encourage them to reach the full breadth of their technical vocabulary. There is a bookend change inspired by Jan Martel's We Ate the Children Last, omnipotent third person, allowing an omniscient view of the character and reflection on the moral state of our world before a more emotive viewpoint. The shift to first person is emphasized through the sudden voice of fear, presented in low-frequency lexis, condemnation, reconcile, foolishness, producing a tone of desperation and foreboding, compounded by religious lexis, which is later repeated. My joy, my life, my strength. Here, the anaphoric triplet of abstract nouns presents the plants as integral to the woman, and the biblical allusion to Jesus, inspired by the intertextuality in the Kite Runner, foregrounds the magnitude of climate change. Ally then seeks to rouse an international responsibility as collective address is used to unify and self-deprecate, to provide audience alienation. However, the deliberate shift to direct address is utilised in the repeated fact by the time you, and the triplet of rhetorical devices in the middle of the speech, including your grandchildren can deal with it anyway. This rebukes carelessness and selfishness, whilst the relation to family triggers higher responsibility. A shift to collective responsibility is immediately reinstated as the pronoun we is utilised to avoid antagonising the audience. Both texts therefore cooperate to drive their audience to self-evaluate and take culpability of the current environmental destruction worldwide, evoking reaction to redeem it. I don't think you'd be shocked to know that this gets 24 out of 24 for the commentary. One or two very, very minor issues, but equally absolutely no reason to keep this student from the top. They have done absolutely everything. They've been concise, they've covered the assessment objectives, and it was a genuinely engaging and engaged piece, engaging from my perspective to read it as a moderator, and engaged from their perspective in terms of the topic and their ability to reflect on their crafting. So I don't think anyone would be shocked to see 24 out of 24 there. Equally, if students are not quite as confident with some of the range of vocabulary that's used in here, a substitute for some of those devices could have easily reached 24 out of 24 as well. It's not because they've used some particularly technical terms, it's the analysis of those terms that gets them up to that top mark score. So don't be too threatened, or encourage students not to be too threatened if that is the case. So I'm going to take you through two of their original writing pieces now. Here we've got a dystopian short story. So you've already heard from the commentary the rationale behind this story, but some things to note, and I'll give you a summary slide in a moment that will contextualize some of these examples. But things to note here is just their really clever use of structural devices in terms of how they've tried to be a bit playful with structure, how they've tried to craft for impact, and how they've really considered audience engagement here. I also want to draw attention to the teacher's comments. You can see here we've got two different, there's clearly been moderation within the centre is what I want to try and emphasise to you. We've got two different perspectives, and we've got evidence of where there's been agreement or disagreement and convergence on the marks at the end. If there's opportunity within your departments, please do factor in some time for internal moderation. and maybe encourage it as an opportunity for students to even moderate each other's work and provide some feedback. That's absolutely good practice, and do encourage as many eyes as possible from your teaching staff to be able to look at some of these texts and give some feedback to give them the best possible opportunity to agree with the marks that you've arrived at. Desperate, East Sussex, Nimble Cottage, June 2026. Awakening with the wrens and turning in just as the owl soared over the setting sun, she nurtured her patients tenderly. With the utmost care and respect, her cotton bonnet sat scruffily but securely in a nest of her grey and white hair. Her hands were plastered in dusty dirt, clutching anxiously at remedies and equipment, cutting, covering, mending, comforting, each a wild attempt to treat the last victim. And her eyes were tired and desperate, but diligent. So here we've got some really nice controlled crafting. There's a real sense of security here with their writing. There's no idea, there's no sense that they're going to move away from this narrative perspective all the way through. And we get that already, that introduction to some of the ideas that they've explained in the commentary, the reference to patience, for example, the narrative perspective of the old woman who's tending to the garden. Desperate. Callous condemnation is hanging over humanity, haunting every mindless action repeatedly taken, taunting like a grand finger pointing at us, mocking our previous foolishness, and smirking at our current futile attempts to reconcile. I hear its haughty laugh every time I wake to the merciless sunrise. It fractures the silence of what used to be we used to be content blackbirds pottering around and the bees quietly muttering to each other. Muttering to myself, I eased out of bed, squinting at the glare of the heightened sun. I pulled my cotton bonnet on, plastered on the protective cream over my face with my painfully half-scrunched hands, opened the patio door and tried to blare out the hideous slash progressively tearing its way through my ward in the hospice. It had been inflicted in the last water ban. Slowly, I made my way over to the beds and peering at the rows of casualties. As always, it was tragic and desperate. A few of my friends had faded in the night. Some patients were drooping dreadfully, clinging onto the supports I'd got for them yesterday. Numerous others had mustered the strength to decorate the place with a few splashes of precious lime, fuchsia and golden bunting. It sat above their increasingly flaccid bodies, but they were all critically dehydrated. Dewdrops and turgidity was a distant memory of many dawns ago. So here, a really good example of some really conscious crafting. All of that vocabulary is quite clearly consciously chosen to create emotion, to create emphasis, and to draw attention to some of those themes that have been explained in the commentary. So having read the commentary, we can really see some of the reasons and the consciousness behind this crafting that helps move it up into those top layers. And some of the sophistication as well in terms of how they've tried to be inventive with some of these literary devices. They're not simply creating metaphors with the plants, but that relationship that's developing between the nurse, I guess, in this instance, the older lady, and the patient's hair plants. So you can start to see that relationship developing through this language. Inspecting further, I hobbled over to a corner where my most beloved patient sat in her bed, Lytherus Audatus, or the sweet pea, as most people commonly knew her. Hunching over, my knees grinded as I ignored the moaning arthritis and gave her the respect that she deserved. After all of my years, she was within and throughout, interwoven with the pages of my life, a motif within the memories, the first scent I smelt after I came back from hospital after having Lillian, a descendant of the seeds I'd collected with her son, my first ever grandson. I carried out her usual obs. She was weaker, disfigured, thinner, fainter, moving. Something was moving within her, over her, inside her, grotesquely. The next biblical plague sent by the master, aphids. Sprawling, vampire-like menaces embraced her, each fatal kiss injecting thousands of murderous microbials into her tube. She transported them helplessly around her organs. I couldn't bear to look. She frothed, foam poured out of her. She could have fought them before. I flinched. She faltered, frail like my fingers that tried to flick the filthy flies off. I sprayed, squished, cursed desperately. She wasn't even finished yet, but they already came before she was gone. It all felt wrong. She'd always been my joy, my life, my strength, as sweet as if she were the most wonderful sunset for the nose. My friend would marvel. It was true. Although she was always dressed beautifully with linens delicately draped all over her elegant figure, her real charm was the angelic scent that settled, always, in a 2 meter radius around her, blessing the dear person who walked past her that day. I fell in love with her grace and understated blooms each year. She always came alive in summer. Her countenance would light up and her clothes would erupt into a wonderful fiesta of rich magentas and soft violets. She'd always been there at my wedding, too. She gave me the confidence to walk down the aisle. She held my hand the whole way, her soft perfume drifting up my nose. She was more loyal than any friend could ever be. Friends. Friends wouldn't watch as the other slowly faded away. They would do something. The thought repeatedly plagued in my mind, if only I could have given her a drink this morning, maybe it would have given her the strength to find them, given her a few more days to fight them, given her a few more days. But my darling sweet pea was now no more than aphid sustenance. They were the finale of the massacre sent from the master. She lay grotesquely and hot, too hot. A final petal lay on the bed, and I watched as the colour swiftly faded, like being sucked through a plastic straw. My master had won again. He claimed yet another of his beige trophies, one of the last to be claimed in England, but nevertheless claimed, and all desperately dry. I hoped the water falling from my eyes might offer just a hint of life, bring back my friend's vigorous vitality and the outstanding oasis she'd gifted me with, bring back the pure, sweet air that gently caressed my lungs, bring back the symphony of harmonious variety and the red-spotted warriors who'd valiantly fought the consistent aphid attacks, bring back my sweet pea, my lobelia, my rose, my sunflower, my friends, and banish the beds of patience and the fiendish fracture that scarred the barren hospice. An open wound of ugly baked beige, the master's trophy. Bring back everyone's wonder, a sunset for the senses. The frail lady sat down. She readjusted her cotton bonnet, yanking it to hide the anguish that trickled from her eyes and immediately evaporated in the dizzying heat of the setting sun. They'd always said the master wouldn't reach her, that it would only affect the grandchildren's children, but it grew in power a lot quicker than they had expected, and its servants were strong, stronger than the old lady desperately trying to save her beloved garden. She squinted at the master in utter indignation. Her eyes were desperate and defeated. She'd lost the most treasured sunset of life. Again, I don't think you'd be surprised that they collectively agreed within that centre, as well as the moderation, to award that 18 out of 18. I think it's an amazing achievement for a student to produce something that's so concise and so moving in such a short word count, to be able to really offer a fully developed narrative in 1,000 words is a truly, truly remarkable skill. Not every student is going to achieve 18 out of 18. And it's clear to see that the level of 18 out of 18 is fully deserved. If there were more marks that you could have given this student, I'm sure they could have reached higher. And there may well be even some 18 out of 18s that won't look quite as accomplished as this, but it would be wrong to not give that student full marks in this instance. The TED Talk, on the other hand, so we move to a different genre here, but what we can see with this student is that there is a conscious attempt all the way through to have that sense of purpose unifying all of their texts. They've made a really good choice to talk to sixth former students here, so a lot of this crafting is something within the realm of their understanding, and that's a really good choice for that student. They've really tried to pick something that they can get their teeth into and that they can understand. TED Talk. Our mightiest ally has switched sides. Our belching out of climate change spiel is distracting us from actually acting. And now our mightiest ally has switched sides. 9 years ago, I wrote an article about saving the rainforest. It was the typical year 4 adjective embellished exclamation mark excessive column that somehow came top 10 in a Stabilo Young Journalist of the Year competition. Big flex, I know. I really believed that nearly a decade later, we would simply have solved the problem. By the time you finish listening to this sentence, 3 hectares of forest have been cut down. Throughout the text, you'll see that the student does this. There's lots of conscious attempts to bring home that message through direct address, and it really does create some impact. So notice that as we go through. The problem remains. We are still demolishing our own life support by cutting down rainforests. In simple terms, rainforests are richly erupting with abundant gifts, animals, cocoa, potentially life-saving cancer drugs. They supply us with oxygen, exchanging it to store huge amounts of carbon, twice the amount of carbon that they can then emit in respiration, acting as a crucial carbon sink. But things have changed. By the time you finish listening to this sentence, another 3 hectares of forest have been cut down. 3 hectares is equal to over 4 football pitches. Our mightiest ally has switched sides. Now 1/3 of our carbon emissions are caused by deforestation. In continually forfeiting our rainforests by hacking and burning them down for our own futile and frivolous fulfillment, we surrender the ultimate warrior in our battle against climate change. In COVID-19, scientists worked tirelessly day and night to provide a vaccine that would combat the deadly virus. It was an international emergency. Climate change is an international emergency. It's not a mild inconvenience to be dismissed for future generations or a topic to be perpetually pushed away by facts and facades of progress. It is an international emergency and a battle we are deemed to lose, especially when we insist on pushing our mightiest ally to abandon us. With Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva back in office in Brazil, our ally is not completely lost. There is hope for the Amazon rainforest, at least. Hope that he will continue to dramatically drop deforestation levels. It's already dropped 66% compared to August 2022. Hope that he might possibly push to achieve targets of no deforestation. Hope to negotiate our greatest ally back on our side. By the time you finish listening to this sentence, another 3 hectares of forest have been cut down. Maybe this doesn't resonate with you. It's a problem which is too far into the future. Your grandchildren can deal with it anyway. But we didn't leave our grandchildren to deal with the problem of COVID. It was an international emergency. Well, so is this. We are reaching a tipping point with our rainforests. We are on the edge where every crucial action and counter move has an impact on our future. One wrong move and there will be irretrievable loss. Now, let me get this straight. I'm not the next Greta Thunberg urging you to skip school and protest for the rainforests. Sorry, no excuses for skiving school here. But I am warning you that our problems will not just go away. As I wrote this, I contemplated whether or not there's anything we can really do. I'm not going to shove a list of unrealistic top tips in your face. Of course it's heroic, use less loo roll and poke around in public protests about rainforests. But let's be honest, the loo roll is going to keep coming whether you use 2 or 3 squares. The majority of the population will continue to indulge in luxurious 4 square white and trees will be cut down. And yes, a public protest might give you a hot 2 seconds of a TikTok fame, but check in on the next day and it's old news. However, we are the new generations. We are the brains, the creativity, the problem solvers, the future, and we need to see the worth and the value in one thing that freely and joyfully provides us with so much. We must educate ourselves about the rainforests. The optimist in me hopes in 9 years' time, when I reach the distant age of 27, I will live in a world where we don't sabotage our own air. I hope that when we won't be destroying the one thing we need to survive in a world that can facilitate us. Perhaps I know deep down this won't be so, but think about it. In 9 years, the Curiosity rover discovered water on Mars in 2014. Multi-use reusable rockets were landed successfully on Earth in 2015. Facial recognition technology was released in 2016. Hamilton was unleashed in the West End in 2017. The first photo of a black hole was taken in 2019. The Lionesses won the Euros in 2022. Whoop, whoop. There became 3D bioprinted human livers and kidneys, and Taylor Swift released more songs than I can ever listen to. We have the capacity to do great things, so pay attention. Our belching out of climate change, facts and stats, and policies is distracting us from being proactive. The rainforest is our mightiest ally, but handled badly, our biggest threat. Look at what we've accomplished in the last 9 years. If we can do all this, then surely we can spend more effort, resources, and research on saving our rainforests. It's simple. The costs of action annihilates the cost of inaction. By the time you finish listening to this sentence, another 3 hectares of forest have been cut down. Our mightiest ally has switched sides. 1/3 of our carbon emissions are caused by deforestation. There is no bigger emergency to save our rainforests. It couldn't be more urgent. Let's add to the list. Deforestation ended in 2024. Again, 18 out of 18 there because of the obvious conscious crafting, the sense of control, the stylistic features. It's really to see why this folder achieves full marks. We have included the final folder in this pack. I think it's folder F that should be the final one, yes. That's another example of a top level folder that doesn't get full marks, so you can compare the two. We won't be reading through both of those today, but that will be a takeaway for you to compare. So I have a raised hand. I've just seen that there. Sorry, it's folder A. I'm not sure if that was related to that. I couldn't see any chats while we were reading through those. I was unaware that there was still an option to produce a piece of creative writing as part of the coursework. Can you please point me towards the relevant documentation? And which folder is this one so I can follow it? So we've got folder A here. And in terms of the question about creative writing, yes, it's a piece of fiction and a piece of non-fiction. Both constitute creative writing, I guess, in some sense. And that's detailed within the specification. So if you have the specification document, you will be able to find an outline of that course there. But yes, the creative component is the only thing that you're marking with AO5. So that's piece 1 and piece 2. And the commentary is the analysis of those creative pieces. They just need to be split into creative fiction and creative non-fiction writing. So hopefully that's answered any of those questions. I'm going to stop sharing to be able to go back to the presentation here just to give you a recap of why that receives full marks, but hopefully it's quite easy to see why that receives full marks. I'm just going to switch these around. Here we go. Oh, we've gone right back to the beginning. So folder A, an example of a top band folder, really easy to see why. This is an expectation of the very, very top level. Very rarely we're going to see students who are at this level of control and sophistication in terms of their writing, nor is it the expectation that every level 5 folder would be at that very top level. But you can see a really different and distinct element of crafting because of the awareness of genre in both of the text. So it's quite clear that the use of literary and fictional pieces or fictional devices for the short story are consciously crafted in contrast to the non-fiction, more non-literary devices in the TED Talk. There's a conscious sense of spoken language features versus literary features, and the commentary is just really incisive all the way through. There's a really good balance between core and stimulus material, as well as analysis of their own crafting. So to give a summary of those marks, 18, 18 and 24, full marks all the way through. It is a very, very good example folder, and I can imagine everyone is quite jealous of whoever gets to teach students like this, because clearly that student has taken the time to really craft, edit, re-edit until absolute perfection, and they don't have the chance to do that in the examination. So the coursework is an excellent opportunity to explore that editing process and that drafting process. Don't be too intimidated by that higher level. Not every student is there, but it's a really good example of what the top level could look like. Like I said, folder F is a nice one to contrast with that. When you take away some of these materials, go back to this one and compare it with folder F, another high level folder, not quite as accomplished, but equally assured in its marking distribution as well. In terms of the next folder, we're going to look at a student piece. I'm going to read through the commentary with you, and then I'm going to give you a mixed break. I'm going to give you a working break for 10 minutes to give you a chance to read to give the creative pieces, the non-fiction piece and the creative piece. Again, two very different tasks, two very different voices, and a step down into level 4. However, what I want to explore a little bit more and give you the chance to kind of read through those pieces is the reason why we're stepping down at this point. It's still a very ambitious folder, and this student still has a really clear sense of crafting and argument and rationale, but there's a clear distinction between this folder and the previous one before it. We can see as well the use of narrative voice for the fiction, as well as the sense of audience in the non-fiction. I would argue maybe the fiction piece is slightly stronger in some aspects, but equally there's a conscious sense of crafting for audience in non-fiction as well. So there's a clear difference between this folder and folder A. I'm going to read through the commentary with you before I share the marks from this whole folder, but I'm going to give you a working break once we're at the end of that commentary to hopefully read through the rest of that. So hopefully you've been able to download those materials. I'm going to stop sharing this one to go back to folder B. So we're just moving through the pack. And hopefully you can see this on your screen in a second. Okay. So we're just going to read through this commentary together. I believe the commentary is at the bottom, actually. That's why I had it there. Okay. I wanted to show you this just as an example of the bibliography. So here, this is an example of a student who perhaps hasn't used a bibliography format, a specific format. I wanted to show you this because usually one of the questions is there a specific format that students have to use as a bibliography? The previous student used a more kind of obvious system, the MLA system. Here we've got a student who's just listed those examples. It's not necessarily a requirement that they use a specific system, but it is good practice to get them prepped for university where they will be expected to use those systems. And so it's a good opportunity. And those of you who perhaps have students maybe doing extended project as well, this is a good chance for you to get them familiarised just with that process of writing a bibliography. So I wanted to scroll down just to highlight that before we begin their commentary. So, taking inspiration from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, my fiction piece makes use of a first-person retrospective narrative voice in order to provide Jane's experience and the interpretation of events in an additional scene where she goes back to see Bertha. So opening up there, you might think that Jane Eyre is quite an ambitious piece to pick to simply use as a source material for a first-person retrospective voice, but then we get a bit more context about the fact that this is a kind of additional chapter, so this is an extension of their reading of Jane Eyre. I emulate Bronte's use of Gothic conventions, such as doppelgangers and mirroring, pathetic fallacy, and the themes of isolation and madness. My writing would appeal to an audience interested in the Bronte sisters and the Gothic genre. My use of first-person narrative also allows me to reveal how Jane is ignorant to her similarities with Bertha. Bronte explores the Gothic themes of isolation and desperation from the very opening of her novel, when Jane recollects being locked in the Red Room. I shall remember how you thrust me back, roughly and violently thrust me back into the Red Room and locked me up there. I was in agony, though I cried out while suffering with distress. In agony and suffering and distress, Bronte uses emotive semantic fields of misery to depict how rejected and outcast she was made to feel. The repetition of the dynamic verb thrust me back highlights the theme of isolation through entrapment that Jane cannot control. Similarly, in the opening of my piece, I show the Gothic theme of isolation and entrapment surrounding all three of my characters, Mr. Rochester and particularly Bertha and Jane. This is ironic as the narrator, Jane, clearly considers Bertha as other and very different to herself, whilst my narrative uses mirroring to reflect the parallels in their lives. Additionally, as both Bertha and Jane have been trapped away in rooms of grand houses as a means of repression and control, this links to the patriarchal society which dominated the 19th century, as women were seen as the possession of their father or their husband. So you can see here a little bit of the rationale behind the step down from level 5. It's not quite as controlled in relation to its selection of quotation and its ability to embed that quotation. They're more focused on the quotation from their stimulus material rather than from their own materials. An excellent understanding and an excellent representation of Jane Eyre, absolutely here, but you can see why suddenly we're taking that step down. In my opening paragraph, the narrator uses a semantic field of entrapment and confusion. Mr. Rochester is entangled, suffering, ensnarement, and wed, while Jane's psyche is dominated by fear and has a clouded brain, and Bertha's is hidden in the attic. This creates an atmosphere of claustrophobia right from the opening. It is also reflected on the consequences of isolating people and restricting their freedom. I'm introducing a key theme in my piece, which is that isolation leads to intense, repressed emotion and madness. This is highlighted in my very first sentence, where fear is personified and dominates Jane's psyche, showing the power and the control of the all-consuming nature of her emotion and situation. From the opening, we see that our narrator is not in control. Like Bronte's, my narrator dehumanizes the character of Bertha. In Bronte's text, Jane describes Bertha as a figure, as well as repeatedly referring to her as it. I emulate this theme of dehumanization, describing Bertha as a hellish beast. This is particularly effective at that point of the novel, as Jane is unaware of who Bertha is, and yet still does not see her as human, despite being very similar to her. So we've got a nice balance there. They've started to bring in an analysis of their own work there in respect of how it was influenced by the stimulus text. Similarly, my non-fiction piece explores the depiction of women in the Gothic horror genre. My opinion article is inspired by Brooker's articles, particularly introducing the strangest creature in the world, the audience. I emulate Brooker's satirical and humorous voice, as well as directly addressing the audience. In doing this, I create an engaging, personal voice to explore the concerning misrepresentation of women in horror. The use of colloquial and relatable voice persuades the audience to feel culpable and part of the problem, hopefully provoking change. Similarly to Brooker, my piece is written for educated readers, as well as people interested in the horror genre of the representation of women. My piece aims to entertain as well as inform the audience of negative stereotypes which plague the horror genre. Brooker often opens his opinion pieces with a personal anecdote to create a personal and often self-deprecating tone, providing the reader with an insight into his life. Last year, I attended a glamorous TV award ceremony in order to not win an award. Similarly, I open my piece using an anecdotal, self-deprecating voice. It was when the first jump scare hit me that my dignity took a nosedive. I let out a shriek so loud it could have woken the dead. My use of anecdote makes my article more personable and relatable to the reader. This hooks the reader and acts as a persuasive technique as the reader feels more involved in the piece. The hyperbolic metaphor, could have woken the dead, creates a self-deprecating, humorous voice. This mimics Brooker's witty style and juxtaposes the serious topic of the article, making the reader feel more at ease and likely to read on. Additionally, the repeated horror genre lexis in Shriek and Woken the Dead not only references the theme of the piece, but also at this point in the article creates a hyperbolic and humorous voice. As a male, it is effective to describe myself as shrieking and frightened, as it subverts the typical gender stereotypes of the manly man. The self-deprecating nature of this makes it more personable, which appeals to the audience and creates a more credible voice. Through many of Brooker's pieces, he often uses extended metaphor to provoke his audience to make comparisons. For example, in Brooker's article criticizing the media, he creates a continued comparison between drugs and newspapers by using utterances such as heavy users, dealers, and available on every street. This comparison, made me through the use of drug-specific lexis, makes the audience aware of the dangers of the media. Similarly, I craft a continual comparison between the horror in fiction and the horror in real life, using the repetition of genre-specific lexis throughout my piece. Phrases such as haunt the genre of horror, crypts of Gothic literature, and blood-curdling horrors of fiction create an eerie tone reflecting the horror genre and the drawing the reader in. The noun crypts creates the idea that there is an evil behind the horror genre, which in this case is the misrepresentation of women. The mixture of satire and serious debate in my piece is similar to Brooker's, allowing for an enjoyable, captivating read, whilst also informing the audience about the negative real-world impact on horror society. The theme of my piece holds real-life relevance as stereotyping and gender bias in horror genres serve as an impact on modern-day gender dynamics. So here you can see a slightly less secure balance between the reason behind the selection of choice core stimulus material and the actual crafting itself. It may seem like a stretch perhaps to simply pin the self-deprecating anecdotal opening and the similarity between the two texts there. If you compare that with the more subtle, sophisticated use of influence of core stimulus text to folder A, you can see why this one moves down ever so slightly. Like Brooker, although I often use a satirical and personal voice, the themes are relevant to society and of serious nature. This aids the purpose of my piece, which is to inform and educate the audience, while also being engaged and entertaining. The quote, "It is time for the genre to embrace inclusivity and diversity and to challenge conventions and break free from the shackles of outdated stereotypes," underlines the necessity for a shift in how women are presented in horror. The continued genre-specific lexis through the noun shackles maintains the light-hearted nature of the article, whilst also conveying the drastic issue of female representation in horror. In conclusion, in both of my pieces, I explore the horror genre and particularly the role of women within it. I emulate Bronte's use of first person, as well as doppelgangers and gothic imagery in my fiction piece, to demonstrate the personal conflict that Jane experiences. In my non-fiction, I use Brooker's satirical, personal voice to explore female representation in horror and inform the audience of how it affects our modern world. So more lapses towards the end of this piece, and it's quite clear to see perhaps where their preference was in terms of crafting. I do want to give you a quick 10-minute break, just from me speaking, if nothing else, just to give you a chance to look over the fiction and non-fiction pieces that accompany this commentary. So we're in folder B at this point. I'm not going to share the marks until you've had a chance to read through those folders. So feel free to I'll be muting my microphone and turning off my camera for the next 10 minutes. So at 27 minutes past, we'll be rejoining and I'll share the marks from those folders. If you've got any issues during that time, please feel free to use the chat, but take some time to just have a quick skim over those fiction and non-fiction pieces to match them up against that commentary. Okay, so hopefully you've had a bit of a chance to go through some of those features that the student described in their commentary to give you an overview. I'm sure some of you were guessing, maybe not putting it in the chat, which is fine. We won't hold you accountable to those. It's not moderation training. This is just to give you some confidence really when assigning the marks. So if you did think about those marks in your head, then you can reset or congratulate yourself based on this distribution of marks. So here we've got fiction at 13, non-fiction at 15, both out of 18. So the non-fiction stronger than the fiction itself. And the commentary gets 19 out of 24. So I would argue still a relatively good achievement for this student, certainly a step down from folder A, far less controlled and sophisticated, but not a huge step down. So the lapses in times are compensated for what is quite an ambitious, quite a sophisticated attempt at creating that additional chapter. But really, that sense of crafting and purpose in the non-fiction piece really brings that folder up for that student. And there are lots of times where they do kind of make that effort to explore the rationale behind the creation of their devices, their crafting in comparison to those stimulus material texts. And it's nice to see a student with, again, some personal engagement. Something has obviously resonated for them with Jane Eyre, and something particularly about the fascination with the kind of character of Bertha Mason, the way they've created that persona, the use of the kind of the reference to the patois, for example, the use of characterization with the hair and the imagery. It is quite creative. It doesn't feel as sophisticated as the first piece. But even that non-fiction piece creates that really interesting voice of a student with an opinion who's used genre conventions in order to present that opinion and to get their point across. So definitely lots of things to reward in that folder. Although it is a step down, it's no reason to fault that student. Actually, we should be congratulating them for their efforts in what is quite an interesting, entertaining piece. So I'm not sure if those marks married up with your initial thoughts as you were reading through those. And I will be sharing all of these marks at the end of the session. I'm conscious that we have some other folders to try to get through. So I want to go through folder C at this point. Again, we're stepping down, so you'll start to see the quality diminishing slightly. You will see a step down from here, but a significant difference in folder D and folder E. Folder F will be your complete takeaway folder. We won't look at that folder at all. Actually, it's unlikely that we'll get past folder C. However, this is an opportunity for you to take away the marks from those things, the rationale, and hopefully what I'm pinpointing here is some exact examples of best practice within students' work for you to be able to go and take away to your students too. I think what stands out about folder C is the very, very personal nature of this student's work. So there's a lot of references to their own experiences here. There's a lot of rationale in the commentary. I will be giving you a little bit of time to perhaps skim very briefly over those commentary pieces and the non-fiction piece, because we're actually going to read the fiction piece together just to give you a sense of comparison between the first very accomplished fiction piece and this slightly lesser sophisticated, lesser accomplished piece in comparison. So this is purely to show you a difference between those two pieces. And here we've got the student's decision to title this piece Journey of Hope. And again, you might explore some of that in reference to their commentary a little bit later on. But a very clear effort here to summarize the audience, the form, the purpose of the text. Sometimes that's a bit of a kind of clunky way of going about it to pinpoint it so obviously here. I've seen other centres adopt perhaps a cover sheet approach where they maybe encourage the students to list that sheet away from the text and just have it as a cover sheet that it goes along with the NEA authentication documents. And then that's kind of packaged neatly in their folder as part of the presentation. However suits the students. But in this instance, the student is obviously trying to tell us that they have thought about the requirement of thinking about audience and purpose and form before embarking on this text. The reason I picked this one to go through with you today, I wanted to make sure that we had time to read this one, because if you compare the use of structural devices in this piece to folder A, you'll see why folder A gets full marks, and you'll see why this one doesn't quite reach the same. Not to take away from this student's efforts, there is a clear dedication to the piece here and a very, very sensitive topic. So there's still lots to reward in this text, but you can see the difference between the two of them. Journey of Hope, February. 2 blue lines beamed up at me as I eased my head against the undersink cabinet. An electrical current of emotions pulsated through every artery within my body, battering my head against my pale chest, threatening expulsion. Each beat echoed in the eerie silence of the bathroom as my mind raced with a million possibilities. All those trials and tribulations we experienced when trying to conceive faded, were replaced by the profound gratitude and fulfillment. I couldn't stop crying. Tears flooded into my shuddering hands, the hands that still gripped the pregnancy stick that was evidence of what I believed was my entire life's purpose. As moments passed, my tears came in waves, as if my heart had opened a floodgate into the reservoir of emotions from within, leaving me in a profound state of dizziness and disorientation. So there we've got some obvious examples of really conscious crafting of some really nice controlled use of vocabulary. It's just not quite as sustained as the first piece. Even in that first section, there's not quite an engagement with the voice that's created in the same way as that first piece. I've just had a question here. So do the two writing pieces have to be linked? They're linked in an overall, as we saw in that first piece, they reference the individual and society. So they've taken that link from the exam text, which is absolutely fine as long as it's not the theme that you've studied. The idea is that the two pieces have some sort of thematic trend running through them. That can come from their stimulus material, or it can just come from a general threading between those two. But yes, they are supposed to be linked by a theme, or at least within the choices of their two chosen stimulus texts. There should be some thread running through the whole folder. They alerted my husband, who rushed to my side. We had been walking on air for days before, sensing the subtle reposition in our universe. There was a hushed anticipation that everything was unraveling and seeping into the cracks of our foundations. We embraced the weight of our newfound parenthood, sinking in with each heartbeat, in sync with the new life within my abdomen. A moment of profound connection occurred as our eyes mirrored the same assortment of emotions. We rejoiced, despite being aware of the sheer magnitude of what was to come. Our shared plans and dreams felt tangible as we began to embark on this journey of parenthood. It was obvious to us both that our love and excitement bound us even closer than we had been. I know it sounds cliched to those who've never had the experience of being pregnant, but it's true. Having a tiny being of your own growing within you is one of the most incredible feelings you could ever experience. Frequent fluttering of hand and feet create a strange, almost surreal sensation. My baby was a revelation that solidified my purpose in life and gave me hope that everything would be okay. So you can see there just slight lapses in judgment in terms of the crafting, as opposed to the first piece that really sustained that controlled approach all the way through. For the months following, we eagerly anticipated the arrival of our own little human. My contentment grew with my baby as my baby thrived within the womb. I sought approval from fellow expectant mothers, attended prenatal classes, and frequently read novels on women's experiences of motherhood, friends and family eagerly counting down the days in which she would arrive. On the gender reveal, which took place on a beautiful autumnal day, we celebrated her with everyone near and dear to us, overjoyed as an influx of toys, nappies, and baby grows began to litter her nursery. Doctor's appointments became sacred rituals in which the fluttering movements within my womb were nothing short of wondrous. Every kick, roll, and bump decoded in our secret language between mother and baby, and further captured on our digital camera and transported into the memory book. We spent hours upon hours marvelling at the ultrasounds during our regular checkups. We watched in awe as the tiny limbs danced upon the screen, seeking a tangible connection to the life in which we had created. The mere concept of nurturing the life inside me, feeling that raw, unconditional love, was a dream that I'd first had when I was a little girl myself. It felt natural. It felt special. December. My ears protested against the wails, pitches so high my ears may well have punctured and bled. Despite the morning sunrise seeping through the slither in the blinds, I remained dormant. My limbs, moulded into the cushioning of comfort of the mattress, shielded my every thought of the few hours I managed to sleep. Isolation suffocated me as the persistent whines whipped around the four walls of my top floor townhouse apartment and startled me awake again. Pulling back the sweaty linen, I unbuckled my legs with a stretch and a click, and I made contact with the carpet. I stepped carefully across the littered floor, the array of debris, all the shapes and sizes, nappies, empty bottles, baby grows. Reluctantly, I stumbled over to where she lay. Her cries were commands demanding my attention. Her screams of desperation directed me towards where she lay within her bespoke crib. I glared at her as the complex emotions lingered within me. My thoughts were a storm of despair, guilt, and overwhelming anxiety. Our bond was broken. Those delicate baby fingers lunged towards me as if she was reaching for something transient, something better than I'll ever be. Those two dismal blue orbs gazed up at me, reflecting the same blue gaze my mother saw all those years ago. I sought a connection I so desperately wanted. Moments like these would bring any mother joy, but instead fueled the guilt firing up inside of my very core that threatened to escape. Christmas that year should have been an extra special. Instead, it was a blur of constant chores, punctuated by anxiety and fear. Fear of my baby, fear of being an inadequate mother. As the days turned into weeks, I lay awake in darkness, my mind a battlefield of intrusive thoughts and self-doubt. I questioned my ability to be a mother, let alone a good one for my little girl. The family home was now a well of sadness. Strangely, I found an unsettling peace amongst the darkness which shrouded me, providing a flicker of hope and desire. Hope and desire. These were twitching inside of me, itching to get out, but they were suppressed by the weight of the anxiety that consumed me and guilt, so much guilt about not loving my baby. April. Days, weeks, months passed. I was pushed to breaking point. Finally, I reached out. I got the acknowledgement from the nurses that I so desperately craved. Therapy appointments became my lifeline, a time when I could express my inner turmoil in the safety of my counsellor's office. Persistent effort and small victories were celebrated from day to day. I revelled in hours of conversations, countless medications, and hours of sitting in waiting rooms. Eventually, I began to sense reconnection with myself and with my baby. Newfound strength and resilience grew, and I could finally be the mother I always wanted to be. So here you've got this sense of the student working through a really obviously personal story, in the sense that in the commentary, they indicate that the reason they've gone with this particular choice of theme is because their own mother had experienced postpartum depression. So here you've got the sense of that connection with the narrative, the storyline matter, as well as that kind of conscious sense to try to maybe move through to creating a positive message at the end, possibly too quickly at the expense of developing some of these structural features that they clearly wanted to embed. Although the material itself is incredibly ambitious, very emotive, and they do actually quite a good job at using vocabulary to create that sense of emotion, the structural movement through this piece in terms of the development of an arch and a narrative that can be developed and completed within 1,000 words is not nearly as sophisticated as the first folder itself, despite still being a very engaging piece with some very good crafting of emotional language. So here you can start to see how that best fit marking model becomes quite difficult sometimes, because sometimes it's lacking in some pieces and yet sometimes it's strong in others. So finding the descriptors that best fit with the crafting is a really good way of balancing out what this student is doing. There are some grammatical lapses, however, the vocabulary itself is what is carrying this piece through. I will share what this folder was awarded in a second. I realise the marks have been redacted here. That's deliberate. I just wanted to show you some of the other pieces in this folder. So the creative non-fiction writing, just to elaborate on one of the questions before about the theme. So here we've got this kind of theme running through the two texts of the experience of postpartum depression. So the article takes another element, it takes another perspective, and explores how the idea of postpartum depression can be elaborated on, can be explored from a more objective standpoint as opposed to the personal perspective in the fiction piece. So you see the two different sides of postpartum depression with a slightly more kind of less personalized and yet more objective approach in the second piece, but that arguably makes it a little bit more hard hitting to have that kind of the use of the data that maybe supports what people's perceptions are. One of the things that lets this piece down, just so that you've got this in a note perhaps when you come to read through this by yourselves later, you'll notice again some structural features. So here you've got the heading, you've got the subheading, we've got an introduction to the article. And then they've tried to structure through subheadings, perhaps taking on different elements. Now, again, if we think about article conventions, that relates very specifically to a convention that doesn't naturally lend itself to article. It's more of a web piece. And again, we don't get that same sense of a really discriminative approach to genre as we've seen in the other folders. Despite it still being coherent, it's still very clear, it's still relevant. You can see me using the language of level 3 here in terms of the descriptors. That should give you some indication as to where this student fits in relation to their achievement in comparison to some of the other folders. And you will see lots of evidence of students writing very much like this student. Once we get into level 3, you start using that best fit a lot more because you're rewarding one thing, but understanding that perhaps some of the other elements of the work aren't as strong. You do see much more of an array of skills being exerted in these pieces. But even here, we've got the kind of the seeking help, what's best for you. Again, within the article genre, that doesn't quite fit in terms of conventional requirements. The final piece here, you can see the teacher's comment here, and I would always encourage you to put as many comments as kind of first readers and as second readers of these texts as moderators. Please do put your thinking through, and there is no limit really to how much commentary that you can put on there. Encourage the students, as this one has done, to put the word count at the bottom as well. But here the teachers noted that it's not suitable in the style or the form of an article to have these kind of top tips. That does feel a bit more web blog style rather than article itself. Again, we don't have the sense of whether or not this article was for digital consumption online, perhaps with hyperlinks to other pages, more informative pages, or whether this was an article in perhaps a specialist magazine. There isn't that specific sense of crafting in relation to audience and purpose, and that's really quite noticeable. We can see how that affects the dip in quality of that student's work. We do, however, have a really developed bibliography at the end. This has obviously been a text that they've explored or a theme that they've explored in a lot of detail. Arguably, you didn't need quite so many references, but it's nice to see students doing their research and doing some wider reading. You can see here the core text, the yellow wallpaper as well lends itself perhaps to that first text with that really kind of intrinsic exploration of narrative perspective. So we can see the influence there of the yellow wallpaper. We've got the kite runner as well as cupcakes and Kalashnikovs. We can see some parity perhaps with some of these text choices. They're not prescribed text choices. You don't have to only use the kite runner and cupcakes and Kalashnikovs, but there might be some inspiration to take from those. Plenty of other stimulus materials are available, and do please look at some of the examples that are in the coursework materials on the website. But you can see a very developed bibliography here, and if we go right up to the top, you can see the coursework commentary was at the start as well, just to give a bit more of an elaboration behind some of these choices. So just that opening line, after countless nights of my mum pouring her heart out about her traumatic experience of postpartum depression, I deemed it an important moral duty as her daughter to show her the gratitude and emotional support which she did not receive for the countless women all over the world. So there's a really personalized message, I guess, running through all of this text. We can see that this student has really felt deeply about this text. And that's really what is kind of screaming throughout this text, and that's what's really nice to see, the way that the students engaged in this process. Perhaps with lesser personalized material or lesser personal interest material, they wouldn't have been able to craft something quite so emotive. So it was a really good option for them to pick something that was personal and emotional to them. And you could see they develop some of those ideas, with the teacher obviously offering some commentary down the right hand side as to where they've elaborated perhaps, or where there's award to be made on AO2. But even so, you can start to see where they've identified perhaps some lapses in control and weaknesses, as opposed to the first folder, which really didn't have anything of note in relation to the task itself. So that's a really nice comparison in terms of level 3 student achievement versus top level student achievement, with a very kind of similar choice of textual crafting, the reasons why and why not in relation to perhaps a fictional short story element. I'm just going to briefly go through folder D, not to read, but purely to show you just some other stimulus material and how this student approached it. And then I'll give you the marks for all of those folders before wrapping up, and where we've got very little time left. And I do want to give some opportunities. If you've got any questions, please pop those in the chat and I will get to those towards the end of the session. But here you've got a very different stimulus material, Gone Girl, and I'll Be Gone in the Dark. So you've got some true crime coming up here. It's always a favourite of students to look at true crime. They do like that one. So if you do have students, perhaps guide them towards some stimulus material that's really going to get them into some nitty gritty of true crime, so that they can use some of those genre conventions and features. Here, that's a really good example of how the teachers use this in digital format to elaborate on some of their overall comments. It's a step down once again in terms of quality. So the teachers obviously use this as an opportunity to perhaps foreground some of the more positive elements of the folder, just to keep those top of mind, because it is obvious when we look at some of the other folders that this one is not quite as accomplished in its crafting as the others. We do, however, see a nice kind of commentary overall of all of those pieces. And here we've got an example of a student who forgot to check that text list. So that would have been sent back by the moderator for them to fill in there. And the commentary itself, when students lead with that commentary, again, it's good. It's a good practice to do that if the commentary provides a bit of context that would help us understand the rationale behind the construction. A nice developed commentary here. The student does go through a range of these ideas and then nicely moves into, it's quite a long commentary in fact, nicely moves into the stimulus text here, but you can see again we've got this kind of fiction English coursework extra chapter. Again, this might have been perhaps better on a cover page, so that they could just focus on the material here. As you work through this piece, again, the teacher has given us opportunities to foreground some of the more positive elements of this work. Also note as well, the comparison between this folder and the previous folders. If you encourage your students to double space between their work, it helps us as moderators be able to understand your writing without it impinging on us being able to read their work as well. So do encourage double spacing. And here you've got the article text as a stimulus, or as a response to the stimulus, I'll be gone in the dark. Now, what you don't get at the end, in comparison to some of the other texts, is a bibliography. So we have the absence of a bibliography here. It doesn't necessarily lose marks for not having one, but it is good practice to include one. And also it shows how much research that student has done as well. Do students have to have a personal connection to the topic, or can it just be an interest? Absolutely, whatever makes them feel comfortable. It's not to say that we're going to reward any traumatic experiences simply for the trauma, but the more experience they have to draw on, the easier it will be for them to incorporate their personal experience. And when I say experience, it can just as easily be opinion as experience. They don't need to have necessarily gone through something traumatic to get a good mark in this piece of coursework, to use it as literary stimulus. It's merely just an opportunity for them to explore interests. As you can see, those students who use their personal interests as a springboard into their stimulus material get a lot more out of the task, and they're able to explore a lot more materials in a lot more of a sophisticated way. So encourage them to fly with their interests, but they don't need to necessarily have a sub story in order to get a good mark. That's not the case. So folder C gained 10 for its fiction writing, 9 for its non-fiction, and 14 for its commentary. You will be given these materials later on, but if anybody is keeping score here, you can see that overall the fiction piece does kind of hold up that folder, and you can see where best fit starts to come into play. Folder D that we've just skimmed through. Note the choice of stimulus text. It's nice to see students branching out with some of their own choices, and the contrast between some of the other creative pieces. When you go away and do a read through for yourselves, just note the contrast in the quality in terms of the control and the discriminative approach to crafting. Folder D gets 14 for its fiction writing, 14 for non-fiction, and 16 for its commentary. So we get a nice step up from folder D there, and we get a nice bit of variation in terms of the quality there, as opposed to E, which steps down considerably at this point. So this is the lowest scoring folder of the file. You've got fiction writing at 7, non-fiction writing at 6, and the commentary at 8. So if you want to compare any low scoring folders, then folder E is the folder to do that with. And within this one, we've also got the kind of the true crime theme. So you've got two comparatively different approaches to true crime, with a slightly better approach in folder D compared to folder E, which is a significantly lesser accomplished folder in terms of the student work. Folder F is your takeaway folder. Again, another example of a top level piece that isn't full marks like the first folder. However, what this should be is a really good example of a student who gets top level in a very, very achievable way. It's a really, really nice, rounded, well-developed piece, not as accomplished, not as sophisticated as the folder A top level, but a very, very achievable top level nonetheless. So this was very engaging, very assured in terms of its performance. The student has actually chosen The Great Gatsby. They didn't study that for their exam text, but we're obviously personally quite interested in that choice of text. So they've taken one of the other exam offerings as part of their stimulus material. That's perfectly fine. They can absolutely do that as long as they've indicated in the text options that they haven't studied it as part of their course. There's no reason that they can't choose another one of the thematic choices that they didn't study for their exams. It's confident, it's assured, the tone is appropriate, it's well sustained, and the work is well annotated from a moderation centre perspective. So another really good example of best practice to compare with perhaps some of the other folders. So you've got lots of different options of quality. I'm just going to respond to one question that's come in here. Slightly unclear on the difference between a band 4 and a band 5 coursework folder. I understand the top level folders you've shown us are significantly better than others, but you could be more explicit on the specific features of a level 5, not necessarily full mark folder. Hopefully folder F is your example of that. The commentary within folder F should give you some indication as to why that doesn't get full marks as opposed to the first folder. For example, what would a level 5 folder contain that a level 4 folder won't? I understand the basis of that question, and ultimately there has to be fewer folders in level 5 than there will be in level 4. Level 5 indicates a student that has a really assured sense of purpose and a really clear sense of engagement. I think we have to be very clear when we're marking English coursework as opposed to perhaps other elements. We're dealing with some floating signifiers here. What people consider creative or discriminative might differ from centre to centre, but ultimately if you can argue the case for this student, if you see lots of examples of confident, controlled crafting, then by all means argue the case that that student should achieve level 5 for their pieces, as long as you put that commentary in that folder as a center. That's absolutely fine. The moderators will take that into account and they'll be able to understand whether or not you agree or disagree. What I would also recommend, Dimitri, is that you perhaps as a center cross moderate. So if you're ever unsure if something is level 5 or level 4, perhaps compare it to previous level 5 or 4 folders that we've offered in previous trainings. The link to that was given at the start of this session, and maybe offer some other takes and other perspectives perspectives on that from other teachers in the department. Often something about level 5 just screams level 5 at you. And there's often a reason with level 4 that it's not level 5. That may not seem like the concrete answer that you wanted, but unfortunately it is just the case. Often when you're reading a level 5, something about it just feels incredibly sophisticated and accomplished, as opposed to level 4, which ticks all of the boxes and is very well developed, but doesn't quite have that style and flair. So I'm sure you're looking for a really concrete answer in terms of what makes level 5. But unfortunately, when we're dealing with English, specifically with some of these creative pieces, the descriptors are there to reward what is there. And if you can make the case for level 5, the moderators really want to hear that. So pop that commentary in your centre paperwork that you send off as part of your moderation. Some useful tips. We do a lot of cross moderation. Good. I'm glad. And do reach out to other centres as well. If you've got other centres in your area, share examples of folders, get students to look at others' work as well. Look at previous folders. If you've had a moderator's report back that has confirmed a level 5 folder in the past, then use that as your benchmark in your centre as well. You know what your students are capable of. So just use that commentary as your opportunity to shout about what they're doing really well. Word counts are advisory, but do be mindful that it's self-penalising to go over them. Don't spend time on presentational features. We're seeing a lot less of that, thankfully. Some students perhaps take a lot of their media studies students. They want to make it look like an article at the expense of it sounding like an article. We're not going to reward graphological features over linguistic or literary construction. Yes, you can absolutely leave your email, Dimitri. That's absolutely fine. If anybody does want to connect, this is the perfect opportunity in the final few moments of this session to share any emails if you do want to network or share your contact details. Pop those in the chat and you can save those as examples. The presentation of folders, please double space, use 12 font size, and where possible, incorporate evidence of standardization. You don't need to include drafts and style models. It's not necessary. The bibliography is best practice. It won't gain any more marks, but it certainly will prepare them for their next step. In terms of submitting your folders, we're now obviously using the online portal. So you can submit your highest and lowest folders additionally if they're not called within the sample. So your sample will obviously ask for a range of folders, but include the highest and lowest examples folders if they aren't in that sample selection. Please follow the guidance that we've hyperlinked in there and consult the website if the portal is something that you're not necessarily familiar with or is causing any issues. And just to remind you that the deadline for the submission is the 15th of May. I've got a question here as well. I couldn't download Zoom on the Mac. Is there any other way I can get these folders? Yes, they are available as a link that will be available on the website after today's session. So if you check back on the material page of the website, you will be able to find those. The moderators reports, you should have those from your exams officer from previous years, but do ask if you haven't received those already. They are very, very useful in terms of knowing what your standard is and how close to the moderators agreement you were in the past to give you some confidence, hopefully. There are some links here to past training events and do keep an eye on the training page where we will be offering lots more opportunities for you to network and share with each other your experiences, as well as some support specifically on the website, including some exemplar folders, some planners for how to tackle coursework, and a guidebook that would help take students step by step through the process. Do be mindful of grade boundaries, examination statistics, and results plus if you haven't used those already when you come to look at your exams. And just be aware that we do have subject advisory support. If you do want to take part in that in your centres, there is a link there where you're able to ask for those. And if you want to know more about professional development, again, we have hyperlinked that in your session. After today's session, you will be given an opportunity for some feedback. So please do share that. It's absolutely invaluable to us to hear your thoughts and areas of interest that you have for further training and development. And ultimately, you've asked your questions. If you want to put those in the webinar chat, it's absolutely fine. But it leaves me only with a thank you really for today. Thank you for sharing your questions. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I do hope that you've enjoyed the session. I hope to see you on a further training. Do share your details before you leave if you do want to connect and network with other teachers, but keep an eye on those professional development pages and our other course offerings. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat before you leave. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evenings.